Hello, everybody. We're Andy Cornish, and this is my colleague, Mark Burrell.
Hello.
We're here because we have engaged in a series of conversations with prominent Australians on a topic that we're all going to be invited to answer a question about at the latter part of this year, and that is the referendum in connection with the voice. We're going to be asked a question, and that question is a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you agree this proposed alteration? We thoroughly enjoyed the conversations we had with fabulous Australians. And Mark, I think together we found very powerful voices.
Yes, they're deeply impassioned, they're wise, they've committed themselves to the issues that go to the heart of this question. We hope you enjoy. We hope that these conversations stimulate your own thinking and your own conversations with friends and colleagues.
Thank you very much indeed.
Welcome to the Larapinta Connect podcast, hosted by myself, Mark Burrell, and my colleague, Andy Cornish. Part of our Larapinta Connect mission is committed to understanding how we can improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and build bridges of friendship with the business community. Let me start by acknowledging we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and we pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. The topic of the moment is the voice to Parliament. A voice to Parliament is expressed by Reconciliation Australia as giving Indigenous communities a route to help inform policy and legal decisions that impact their lives. Giving people a say will lead to more effective lives. Embedding it in the Constitution would recognise the special place Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have in Australia's history, but will also mean that it can't be shut down by successive governments. This is a big deal, we feel. We're being asked to change the Constitution through a referendum. And since our federation, there's only been 40 referendums, there've been 40 plus referendums, but only 8 of those have been successful. The current Labor government has committed to conducting a referendum on a voice to Parliament sometime in late 2023. While the broad topic is widely known, the issues and underlying goals of Indigenous Australians are not. Our goal is to explore the issues and deepen understanding, to cut through the partisan messages or newspaper bromides and have a genuine dinner table conversation about what this is all about. Joining us today is Dr. Josie Douglas. Josie is a Wardaman woman based in Alice Springs. Josie is the Executive Manager of Policy and Governance at the Central Land Council. The Central Land Council represents the Aboriginal peoples of the southern half of the Northern Territory of Australia. It covers an area over 700,000 square kilometres, with Indigenous people speaking 15 different languages in the region. Josie has worked in community-controlled organisations and held senior research positions at the CSIRO and the Charles Darwin University. In 2017, she was awarded the W.H. Stanner Award for her PhD on young people and intergenerational transmission and acquisition of ecological knowledge. As a signatory to the 2017 Uluru Statement of the Heart, Dr. Josie Douglas is deeply involved in the processes and voice to Parliament and the referendum that we're being asked to engage in. She's also a member of the Referendum Engagement Working Group. Welcome, Josie.
Thank you, Mark and Andy. It's great to be with you.
Well, Josie, maybe to begin with, you're a signature to the Uluru Statement of the Heart. We'd love to hear a little bit about your personal story and what places you in the heart of this important moment in time.
Well, the Central Land Council was involved in convening the regional dialogue in Central Australia. So part of the expert group that Megan Davis was a part of and Noel Pearson was a part of that, the mandate that was given to that group was to hold talks with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around Australia on the idea of constitutional recognition. And so there were 17 dialogues held around Australia, different jurisdictions, different regions, urban, metropolitan, remote. And I was involved with the dialogue that was held in Central Australia that brought together 100 representatives from across Central Australia to discuss the issue of constitutional recognition. And the really strong consensus that came out of that meeting was that Aboriginal people from Central Australia didn't want symbolic recognition. They wanted something substantive, and that would make a practical difference to their lives on the ground. And from that regional dialogue in Central Australia, representatives were selected to go to the Constitutional Convention that was held at Yulara, with the culminating in the final day. That was the ceremonial part of the convention at the Murrujulu community. And so I was also involved in the convention that was held down at Yulara, and that's south of Alice Springs, where I'm based. And again, that was a very robust discussion of all the delegates from around Australia at that convention. And people, again, a very common sentiment expressed was Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people did not want symbolic recognition only in the Constitution. They wanted something more substantive. And that's how we arrived at the Uluru Statement from the Heart, was the consensus that having recognition in the preamble of the Constitution was important and needed, but it wasn't enough. There needed to be something else that would ensure that would make a difference to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives. And that's where you have the three components of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and that is the voice to Parliament, treaty, and truth-telling. And the sequencing of those three things is critically important. And the first matter that was decided to be dealt with and to be promoted and advocated to government was the voice to Parliament. And that's where we are today, with the Albanese government being elected in 2022 and committing to the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. And now in 2023, we have a referendum ahead of us for all Australians to vote and have a say in the voice to Parliament. And of course, we've got a lot of hard work ahead of us because there are differences in opinion. But the Uluru Statement from the Heart is an open invitation to every Australian to cast a vote. And I'm hoping that every Australian who does vote later on in the year in the referendum will vote yes, because I believe that this voice to Parliament will make a much needed difference to people's lives.
Josie, I think it's a wonderful summary that you've given us just then, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a beautiful document, and as you say, it required this commitment, and it's probably worth, as I've got a copy of it here, just to sort of remind all of us that are watching this podcast, is that it absolutely explicitly calls for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution, and that's really important. Could you help us to understand why you think that it's so important that as a sequence, the voice comes ahead of, say, treaty or truth-telling? Why the voice first?
Well, the voice should come first. It it's a representative body. If the referendum's successful, and the voice to Parliament is enshrined in Australia's Constitution. So we need to be recognised in Australia's founding birth certificate in terms of the recognition component of it. And the second component is the voice to Parliament. That needs constitutional protection because we have a history in Australia, Indigenous people. We had the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC, which was established, had a representative function. Commissioners and ATSIC delegates were elected. It received funding, made decisions on funding and services and programs. And it was also a very strong nationally political voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Of course, with everything, there are issues that arise. And what happened with ATSIC, with those issues that arose, rather than dealing with those issues, what the Howard government focused on was the issues of concern rather than the great majority of very good work that ATSIC had done. And so you effectively threw the baby out with the bathwater. And so ATSIC was, with a stroke of a pen, ATSIC was abolished. And out the door went a strong representative voice, a strong voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia. And that was based on, I think, an overreaction to some of the issues within ATSIC, which could have been sorted out. It's a normal, I think, quite a normal process where issues are identified. You work through them. You work with the leadership, and you put in place, mechanisms to correct what the issues were. That didn't happen. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have that experience of having a representative body basically wiped out overnight. So having the voice protected within Australia's Constitution gives it that long-term guarantee, that long-term protection, because it is in the Constitution. And then, of course, the detail of the voice, how the voice operates, that will be decided by Parliament and by politicians from, various parties within Parliament. That's where the decisions around the detail and what the voice looks like will be made. But the important thing is that it has the protection of the Constitution so that it has longevity. And this is a really important point. The issue and the point that's made in the Uluru Statement from the Heart about the powerlessness of Indigenous people in Australia, that points to policy and legislation that gets chopped and changed with each new government, with each new minister, with each new Prime Minister. And there's no long-term commitment to policy solutions. And the voice is about Indigenous people providing policy advice on any policy or legislation that's been made about us. So what we're saying is, don't make policy or legislation about us without us. And the voice in the Constitution ensures that longevity. And if we have that longevity, I think we're, in a really strong position to overcome some of these long-term challenges and issues that are facing Indigenous people across Australia. So that's what the constitutional enshrinement does. It ensures longevity, and it guarantees that our voices can be heard, and that it's a safety mechanism.
And it's also, I suppose, essential that you have the voice first, because you can't really talk to situations of treaty and truth-telling until you have a mechanism that's the voice. So it's essential that it comes as the first part of the whole, if you like, of the three-stage process.
Well, that's correct. That's exactly how it is. I mean, if we're talking truth-telling or treaty, you absolutely need a group, an advisory group. You need a structure, a mechanism in place to be able to oversee the truth-telling process, to oversee the treaty agreement, the negotiations around what that agreement would look like.
And I don't know about Mark, but just before you go on, I'm not sure what truth-telling is. Do you know what truth-telling is?
It's a great question.
And if we're not sure, can you just help us?
Yes,
I know
please.
It's not necessarily the moment of the question.
No, let's go there.
But would you mind just sort of helping, us and our viewers potentially as to what do we mean by truth-telling?
Truth-telling, I think there's so much about Indigenous history that Australians are not aware of. They might not have had the opportunity to learn it in school. And this goes to middle-aged people, older people, and even younger people. It goes to the history of Australia, really. It goes to, the very sad history of Australia, actually. The massacres that was committed, stolen generations where Aboriginal children were removed from their families and put into missions. It goes to Aboriginal, stolen wages, where Aboriginal stockmen and those working on pastoral properties, men and women, were working for rations, for tea and sugar and tobacco. And, certainly in the Northern Territory where I'm from, but this is, replicated across Australia, where Aboriginal men and women were the labour force behind the pastoral industry, which, was a major industry very early on within the Northern Territory's history. And that people, worked without being properly paid. And, there's so much of Australia's history, and there's so much, and let me also mention, one of the greatest hurts for Indigenous people is the loss of language in Australia. That is a very, very deep hurt. So when children were stolen and put into missions, quite often they could speak their first language, and not, know English. And then once they were in those missions, they were prohibited from speaking their language again, and got into, serious trouble about that. And so a lot of language was lost across the generations, and that's a very fundamental, deep, profound hurt for a lot of Aboriginal people.
It's a wound, isn't it?
It is. That's a great way of describing it. That's an apt way of describing it. That very profound hurt. And myself, my grandmother was a traditional woman, Waddaman woman, who spoke multiple languages, multilingual. And my mother was a member of the stolen generation. So, and now you have me, English only. I know some words, but I'm not a fluent speaker. And that's a very, deep hurt for me, but also a lot of other Aboriginal people, where, within a generation, that language has been lost in terms of my mother losing contact with her mother, and my grandmother passing away when my mother was a teenager, my mother never reconnecting, and, with, when somebody, in terms of, your family, integrity of your family, when you lose someone like a grandmother, so much goes with the loss of that person, as well as the loss of your grandmother, but it's also the loss of all that grandmother would have, been part of your life.
Yeah. Josie, listening to you, I also imagine that truth-telling is not only, restoring awareness and a connection to the understanding of these issues, but also what's happening now, and what's going on in Indigenous communities and in the lives of Indigenous people. But on that point, one of the things that I've been really struck by, I think it was Andrea Mason who put a challenge to Andy and I, which was we need to be aware of the gap and think about how we close the gap. That's a responsibility for all Australians, and I think that's a beautiful invitation. But she also put alongside it this idea that actually, how can we also raise expectations and raise aspirations? And so I'm really curious to hear your view on how do you see the voice in practice being a vehicle for improving agency and opportunity, and really, lifting the capacity of Indigenous Australians to create what matters to them?
Well, it is about self-determination and agency, and it's about being involved in the design of policy and legislation that's been made specifically about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it's having input at the inception of policy. And that's where you get the agency, because Aboriginal people, we know what works on the ground. We know what the solutions are to the challenges that we face, and we know what the opportunities are. And to be able to provide that advice to Parliament, to the executive, will mean that we will have better designed policies, and better legislation, and better outcomes. And that within itself is very empowering, and it will achieve better results on the ground, rather than spending years, and this is what I've personally been involved with, years and years of advocating for changes to very poorly designed policy and trying to wind back harmful measures within various policy settings. And then it takes years to be heard by government, to be listened by government, and then you may get one or two tweaks in terms of a package that you're advocating for. And that process is very time-consuming. It takes years. It takes hard work from our Aboriginal organisations, from the Aboriginal leadership, representing the views and opinions of our constituents, remote community members, and time is being wasted, lives are being lost within this process of trying to advocate and influence government from the outside, and not getting anywhere very quickly. So it really is about saving lives and cutting back the waste due to poor policy settings, which then equates to, ludicrous programs that just don't work on the ground. And so much energy and time spent So if we had the opportunity to be involved at the inception of policies and legislation being made, there will be, I think, far better outcomes. And we know that where Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are involved in service delivery and program delivery, there are better outcomes. And you only have to look to the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector, and there's been great gains in some areas, and that's because the health, the services of delivering health services to Aboriginal people is best done when it's done by our own organisations.
We've had the opportunity to witness that firsthand. The story of Purple House and just the radical improvements they've made to dialysis treatment compared to mainstream health services. Yeah. Okay,
Sure,
perfect.
Because we had half an hour already.
You can edit out the
You all right, Josie? Is this going okay for you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's going fine. Yeah.
It's actually it's a nice pause because I'm still impacted by what you said about the impact. I didn't know this part of your own story, that you yourself didn't get the opportunity to learn your mother's and your grandmother's multilingual experiences. That must be hard, I imagine. Because I think of my own story. My mother's an Italian immigrant, and we never learnt Italian, and I feel a sense of remorse about that. That's only I think a small example compared to yours, but maybe we can pick up on that.
No, but it's a very, it comes from the same premise of loss, because there's so much in language that's part of your culture that can only be described by your language. Imagine that it's the same with the Italian language. So, very similar issues around language.
And there's 60,000 years of history.
But can I just say, but sorry to interrupt you, Andy, but the issue around language is this. So if you wanted to go back and learn Italian language, you have a country that you can return to. Yeah. There's so much language, apps and documents and materials, language classes that you can tap into. In terms of Indigenous languages in Australia, there's not a country that I can return to of millions of people to learn Waterman.
No.
My language group is southwest of Katherine.
Yeah.
So I think there's just a small number left of Waterman language speakers. It's an endangered language. So that's the difference.
Yeah.
So I think that's of interest, but I think it's probably a little bit of an abstraction away from the topic that we want to talk about now. I'm really interested. Your answer to the question about, so the last question that we asked you is sort of a question of how this would work in practice. And the essence of what you were saying there is that we have a bottom-up approach where the local community is getting in at the first moment that a conversation is taking place about a specific issue and is there trying to make an impact and make a difference. So what I'm sort of intrigued by is when I'm on the ground outside of Alice Springs and in communities outside of Alice Springs, and we see 90% unemployment and see very little in the way of opportunities for kids out in community. And, Mark and I are trying to do our best to support that community of the youth in the MPY region, for example. So what are you thinking will happen come the execution of this voice that will make a difference to them in their lives at a really sort of a tangible, practical level? What would you wish for them and what would you expect for them?
Well, what I wish for remote communities is that there's enough housing for everybody, that there's a reduction in houses being overcrowded with 20 or 30 people living in a house. I would like to think that young people have the opportunity to experience work, and I'll speak more to that point. I would like to think that there would be jobs, particularly for our youth and our young people, and that there would be education opportunities available in terms of education service delivery. For many remote communities in Central Australia, education stops at year 7. So if you have a remote community of 400 people or 600 people, for example, in Central Australia, education in most communities stops at year 7. And if there's enough numbers, the middle years of school may be offered, years 7, 8, 9. But there's the business model around service delivery of very small numbers in a class. So generally speaking, for remote communities, education stops at the primary school level, and then if you're wanting to go further, it's either boarding school or moving into Alice Springs. You can, board in Alice Springs and attend secondary. But for a lot of families, this isn't ideal in terms of young people living away from their families, being very homesick. And if young people have got limited literacy and numeracy, sending them off to boarding school interstate or even boarding school in Alice Springs, unless there's a really wraparound literacy intervention to help that student, they're soon going to drop out because it's not a very pleasant experience.
And it takes them out of community. It takes them out of community as well, doesn't it? So it removes them
out of community.
Yeah.
So, I'd hope that, there's employment, there's education opportunities, that housing's available, that there's a better service delivery for remote communities in terms of youth programs, in terms of the services that most Australians take for granted that they can receive, in terms of food security, that their local store has, has food that's affordable, and fuel that's affordable, in terms of energy security. We know that, that remote Aboriginal people pay very high power and water, electricity, for the electricity for their houses. It's very, very high because of the remote location. But getting back to the point, how will the voice make a difference on the ground? I've just kind of overviewed some of the differences that need to be made in terms of housing, education, employment. If the voice existed and was up and running, I'll go to the point of employment on remote communities. So remote communities, if there's just not enough jobs to go around, there's not enough jobs on a remote community, there's a set number of jobs available per a large community population. What I've been involved in advocating is reform around the Community Development Program, or CDP program, and that's Work for the Dole. Now, you could actually use this CDP, Work for the Dole program, as an important mechanism for this. There's a lot of work being done on what the reform measures are, but I'll just speak to what it could be done for youth and young people on remote communities. It could provide an opportunity for local organisations on a remote community, whether it's aged care, whether it's a local media organisation, or an Aboriginal community control program delivering youth services, or even work in the clinic or the school. So there's There's jobs that need to be done within the social services of a remote community. You could tailor the CDP program to have a youth component so that young people could be offered traineeships to be working across the social, in a role within the social service roles that would be needed in a community. But of course, currently, the rules of CDP is that you have to be 18 years or over to access CDP, because the thinking is that goes to mainstream, you can only get on CDP or unemployment benefits or work for the dole. For mainstream is you either have to be earning in work or learning, going to TAFE or college or university. In the remote context, there's not a job for young people to tap into and work for your local fast food joint or your local cinema or your local retail outlet. So that's not possible. And like I explained earlier, those education opportunities aren't available either. So legally, a young person can leave school at 14.9 months old across Australia. So a simple solution to CDP in terms of our young people that are remote is to lower the age so that young people, 15 years and above, can tap into roles that is needed to be performed on a remote community, and have the experience, the opportunity to experience work. This isn't currently available. So that's an example of how you could modify and tweak the rules of CDP to help change someone's lives. But I've been involved personally in advocating for change to CDP for the last 6-7 years. And the Labor government, Albanese government, has announced that will be making some changes to CDP and reforming CDP program. But still up in the air is this very issue in terms of the age that a young person can tap into it. So if we've got young people on remote communities engaged in meaningful work in a role that's been identified by a community that needs to be done, it's work, it's a job. They've got something to do. At the moment, those opportunities just aren't there.
When I listen to you outline those examples, Josie, just to put a blunt phrase to it, it seems like the Voice is a no-brainer in its capacity to sort of, get government interference out of the way and attention to the issues that will make a difference on the ground. I don't know why government agencies have been hard of hearing and have been unable to be influenced in this way so far. But I think it brings up the question of why there are people saying no, that there are other ways to create these outcomes. One of the things that we've heard is that there's a concern that the Voice actually becomes another layer of bureaucracy, both governmental bureaucracy and political bureaucracy. Could you tell us a little bit about how you're making sense of these no voices and how you invite our listeners to think into those issues?
Well, I think the no campaigners and the people who are advocating for no, they have got nothing to lose within this. They have got the least to lose. Whereas for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have got the most to lose. The people who are advocating for no, they will wake up the day after the referendum and their life will be very little changed, whatever the outcome, however Australia decides to vote. The no campaigners, those loud voices saying no, 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 their lives won't change. But for me and my family and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, we wake up the day after the referendum and our lives will be forever changed, whether Australia votes yes or no. If Australia votes yes, our life will be changed because it's nation building, it's bringing the nation together. There's going to be better outcomes across health, education, employment, housing, those really important social policy that make a difference in people's lives. Our lives will change because there will be better outcomes. Lives will be saved, money will be saved. There will be stopping, wasting resources on policy that just doesn't work. That's not delivering the outcomes that they're supposed to be delivering. If the vote is no, and I wake up the day after the referendum and the vote is no, I do not know whether Indigenous people will ever come back from a no vote.
So say more about what that means.
Because it's just going to be, it will just be a huge setback. Australia has voted, and if the vote is no, that sends a very strong message to me, my children, my grandchildren, that you are not important. Your voices are not important. And to me, it's a signal of contempt. It's the nation saying to me, we hold you in contempt, and it's actually nation-sanctioned contempt because Australia has voted that you don't count, you don't matter, we've been here for, the Australian population has 7 generations of calling Australia, this beautiful continent of ours, home, whereas Aboriginal people have thousands of generations of calling Australia home. And we wake up the day after and it is just a huge blow that I really do not think we will ever recover from, and I don't think Australia will ever recover from in terms of that vote. I just don't see how we'll ever come back from a no vote. It will just set Australia back so far.
Powerfully put, Josie, and thank you for expressing it so clearly and articulately. I think there's a lot of people that have got wonderful support for the intuitive view that we need a better go for our local First Nations people. The fear that I hear when I'm having barbecues with friends and so on is that they're confused by the way they should be feeling, because there's so much in the press at the moment. And as Mark was saying at the very introduction of this, we want to get over the press bromides and not get too involved in all of that. But there seem to be so many conflicting opinions out there. If you've got a simple message that you'd give to our viewers, our listeners, as to what they should be thinking about and considering when they're waiting to put their cross on the referendum.
A yes vote will improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the improvements will be based on policy advice provided by Indigenous people on the policies and laws that are being made about us. If we have our voices heard and we have input into the design of these policies and laws, there will be better outcomes, there will be improvements, and it will mean a difference in people's lives, in people's lives today and tomorrow, and for our future generations. And I think Australians do want to see improvements, and they're probably as frustrated with politicians and government for their own reasons. Politicians and government can be very frustrating. And for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the frustration is really 200 plus years in the making in terms of fighting to be recognised and to have our voices heard, to have our solutions taken into account. And the voice is really about stop playing politics with our lives. If you take the politics out of Aboriginal affairs, you will get a better improvement in people's lives. And I think that's what most Australians would like to see. And I hope that most Australians do vote yes in the referendum ahead of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, very impassioned. And I think as I listen to you, my sense is that there is huge goodwill and a desire by many Australians to actually create a mechanism that sets up opportunities for these sorts of changes. One last question that I think our viewers will also be interested on, this sort of no issue before we move on, is the concern that the Voice will set up a process of interruption in the functioning of executive government, and sort of all the legal confusion around and arguments. There's one High Court judge who says no, it won't, another who says yes, it will. So you could sort of take whichever, at the moment anyway, take whichever side. Do you have a position on that perspective that also can just help people navigate that and arrive at a sense, a way to make sense of that?
Well, look, what's happening now, how it works now is that, we're already advocating within the bureaucracy to ministers, but it's not joined up, and it can be ignored and it can be dismissed, and you can speak to a bureaucrat. Can be a telephone conversation, and that can be put down to, oh no, we've consulted, we've sought the views, that telephone conversation. Whereas we know that that's not true or proper or adequate consultation. So the Voice to Parliament is about putting in structures and processes around the advice that's provided by Indigenous people on policies and laws that are being made about us, and that will predominantly impact on Indigenous people. So it's ensuring that when advice is given, that there's a process around receiving that advice and a process around how that advice is treated and actioned. And this is why the Voice to Parliament is so important, because it's accountability and transparency to the executive, to government, and to the public servants and bureaucracy. Accountability and transparency, so that meetings that are held, that happens now, and phone calls and workshops and all that advice that's provided, it's very easily dismissed, not accounted for, ignored, and we're in the same old boat as we've always have been. So that's the power of the Voice, is that there's structured and processes and transparency around the advice that Indigenous people provide on the policies and laws that are being made about us. It is really as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very clear.
And I'd just like to go back to the point about the no campaigners. There's so much misinformation about the Voice to Parliament, and how it will disrupt this or disrupt that. I mean, the Attorney General of Australia has made it very clear that it will not disrupt the functionings of executive or parliament, that the rule of law will be maintained, that every matter will not be taken to the High Court. And this is all part of the fear-mongering that's being generated by the No campaign, and the moral outrage coming from the No campaigners that Indigenous people would be able to provide advice on matters that impact us. What is so outrageous about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people providing advice on policies and laws being made about us? The same scenario is being played out across Australia in all different, ways, in terms of laws being made about self-funded retirees, or, laws being made, across different spheres, where you have strong advocacy groups. You have groups saying, hey, you need to take into account our views before you go and pass that law. Well, it's no different for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I don't really understand the moral outrage and the performances. It's very performative, performances of moral outrage around why it's so outrageous that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would be able to provide advice on policies and laws being made about us.
Josie, I think you've given us a wonderful conversation topic to be had, because I think your powerful sentiments associated with why this voice is so important is something I can feel is a very emotional thing for you. It's so important to you and to so many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. So on behalf of Mark and I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you for the way that you come to this conversation today, which has been enlightening and something I've thoroughly enjoyed, and I know that Mark has too. So we'll leave you with the final word if there's anything that you would like to add. But I just wanted to say on behalf of us, thank you very much.
Well, let's ask Josie the concluding question that I think is very relevant.
Okay.
So regardless of one's view on the voice, Josie, what's the conversation that you'd love us all to be having that can build greater connection with First Nations people?
That's a very good question. You've caught me off guard now, because look, I think it's a conversation around what will make a difference in your life, and what would you like to see happen for that difference to be brought into existence. And I think that just opens the door for people to be able to provide a very, personal response to what needs to be done to make a difference in their lives. Because fundamentally, what we're talking about with the voice is structural change and systemic change, and change how the Parliament works, change how the bureaucracy works in terms of receiving advice. That's the change. So it's being pitched at a structural, systemic level, but fundamentally what it comes down to is how those changes, and those changes are needed to be made to be able to make a difference in people's everyday lives, grassroots people on the ground, everyday Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also our most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in our communities who have no voice. So that's the structural and system change needs to be taken care of and brought into existence with a yes vote, to be able to make those very practical on the ground changes. Because without the structural changes, things will just continue to keep failing. And the voice to Parliament is about stopping the continuation of failure, and saying a line in the sand to say our voices need to be part of and included in the design of laws and policies being made about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So you need this big change, this structural and system reform to happen to enable those changes on the ground, so that people are feeling the solutions and the positive outcomes in their everyday lives on the ground. But that won't happen by itself unless you have these structural changes.
Thank you, Josie. Well, I always feel like I learn a lot in every conversation with you, and I feel very privileged for this time. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Josie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank
Please
you.
vote yes, everybody.